Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone, to day 4 of our exciting inaugural Champlain Institute. So far, we have been talking much about democracy and liberty. Ryan Lizza started us off by talking about freedom of the press and the way that that freedom is enshrined in the Constitution. Our great anthropologists, Lauren Coyle and Larry Rosen, talked about metaphor and time and culture as a way of protecting freedom and democracy across cultures. And yesterday, Michael Gerhardt talked about how the structural Constitution protects liberty by diffusing power. Today, we will talk about equality. The original Constitution did not protect equality. Although Jefferson promised it in the Declaration of Independence, it took the Civil War, the bloodiest in American history, culminating in the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, guaranteed equality, and extended to African Americans the right to vote. There is no one better in America to help us think through as a group the complex clashes of different notions of constitutional equality and how they're playing out in the news in the most dramatic and relevant way. And we're going to jump right in by starting with this morning's paper. I guess the story posted last night in web time, but we learned from the New York Times that Harvard University, whose president, whose board of overseers you presided over, is being sued for allegedly discriminating against Asian American applicants in enforcing its affirmative action policies. Tell us about the facts of the case, and then describe the constitutional principles on both sides that the Supreme Court may evaluate if it decides to hear it.
Great. So first of all, let me say it's such a delight to be here at the College of the Atlantic, and I want to thank Darren for not only extending his hospitality to me, but also having his daughter babysit our children. I want to thank our incredibly kind host, Lissa Hodder, and last but not least, I would like to thank my husband, who is in the audience today, Ron Stoneham. So I'm not going to talk about the Harvard case just because I am too close to the facts of the case and could easily be subpoenaed to testify if I talked about it too much. So we both know that 7 hours of deposition, Jeff, is not a fun thing to go through, so let's pass lightly over that. But if we think about the broad structure of cases generally in the university affirmative action realm, what they do is that they take the form of a white plaintiff. Right. This goes all the way back to Alan Backey in 1978, his case before the United States Supreme Court, saying that it violates his equal protection rights for universities to express any kind of favoritism or bump for underrepresented minorities who are non-white. So what happens in these cases, and the court has wrestled with these now for decades, is that the universities offer up two different defenses. The historical defense was the remediation rationale, which said that we have these bumps because we're trying to remedy past discrimination against subordinated groups. Right? So that already we see bubbling up to the surface two very different visions of equality, where, say, Abigail Fisher in the last iteration that came before the Supreme Court in the University of Texas case said, it violates my formal equality to be denied a place at the University of Texas on the basis of my race. So a white person and a non-white person are being treated unequally insofar as the latter group is getting an advantage that the former group is not, and that's unequal. Right? So we'll call that formal equality. Right? And then the other vision of equality is an anti-subordination view of equality. And I would argue that these are really the two different vying forms of equality, which says you can't really just take equality within a slice of time. You have to take it within a stream of time. And if you take inequality within a stream of time, the legacy of, say, slavery and Jim Crow and what have you have led, just to take as an example, African Americans have placed them on such a different footing, right, in society as a whole and in universities in particular, that in order to assure a higher ideal of equality, the anti-subordination account, we would have to give this bump to underrepresented minorities. I actually think there are strong arguments on both sides. I think reasonable people can disagree about which is the stronger vision, but I want to see that as the core conflict. One of the things that is interesting is that over time, the rationale that the universities have adduced has shifted away from remediation to diversity. So if you think about the second defense that universities articulate, it's this notion of diversity and how important diversity is in order to accomplish its educational mission. I understand why that movement has occurred. Diversity, as Lani Guinier at Harvard Law School says, represents those minorities as individuals bringing gifts rather than grievances, right, to the university. And so it's a much more attractive vision of what underrepresented minorities bring. It also means that the benefit of diversity and the benefit of affirmative action is distributed across all populations within the university, and so therefore is not the special perquisite of a particular group, but rather is a good that is disseminated as a public good across the entire institution. One of the troubling things about diversity, though, is that it's often treated as mutually exclusive with the remediation rationale. And I think in some ways that is a bit of a kind of canard, right, or an obfuscation, because when the court shifts to diversity, we can very easily ask, well, if you care about diversity within a university, why wouldn't you care about all forms of diversity, like athletic diversity, or socioeconomic diversity, or musical diversity, diversity in terms of musical talent, or what have you? Right? And the answer that Justice O'Connor gave in a canonical opinion in 2003 called Grutter was to say that race still matters in our society, unfortunately, and that's why we care about racial diversity. But that, to me, means that the diversity rationale is a bit of a Trojan horse for the remediation rationale. I'm all for the remediation rationale to have continued life, but I would like it to have a continued explicit life rather than an implicit life, right, through the diversity rationale. So in all of these cases, what we see is the white plaintiff coming forward and saying, there's formal inequality here. A white person is not being treated the same as a non-white person. Wasn't the ideal of the original Equal Protection Clause, which says no state shall deny equal protection to, no state shall deny to any person under its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Isn't it the promise of equal protection to give both whites and non-whites the same treatment, and aren't I being treated unequally because of my race? And against that, I think in order to really meet that argument, right, and have that argument feel like it's well met, you would have to take the broader view of history and the remediation rationale rather than the diversity rationale standing alone.
Beautifully described in helping us understand the difference between the formal and the anti-subordination view of equality. On the Supreme Court, Justice Alito has embraced a more formal notion and has suggested that caps on numbers of Asian American applicants admitted might violate formal equality, while Justice Sotomayor has suggested the opposite view and embraced the anti-subordination notion. Help our colleagues understand how they can choose among these two views, because I began, ladies and gentlemen, by telling you, separate your political from your constitutional views. I don't want you to evaluate this question by asking whether you think affirmative action is a good or bad idea. You might think it's a good idea, but the Constitution forbids it, or a bad idea, but the Constitution allows it. So Kenji, how can our colleagues choose constitutionally between the formal and the anti-subordination point of view?
Great. So it's a wonderful question. I think that takes us back to your earlier comments on the stage about the different modalities of constitutional interpretation. So one of the reasons why it's a joy to move from being a literature scholar to being a professor of constitutional law is that I actually get to teach my constitutional law classes as courses on interpretation. So let me actually think about the different modalities that Jeff set out before us. We can actually think about interpreting it according to the text itself. We can think about the intentionalist modality, which thinks about the intent of the framers, which is oftentimes conflated with, but needs to be distinguished from the textual modality in ways that we can discuss. We can think about doctrine and precedent, right? The way in which the court has interpreted the clauses, to have binding effect in the future, simply to offer some stability in legal interpretation. We can think about the prudential modality, the costs and benefits of a particular rule, right? And so on and so forth. So there are multiple ways of understanding the Constitution. There's no one way. And oftentimes when people in our society are talking past each other, it rends my heart a little bit, because I think that they're talking past each other not because they have different views of the Constitution per se, but they're simply arguing from different modalities. And until they meet each other on the modality, they're not really having a dialogue. They're simply talking past each other. But let me actually offer this, right? As a unabashed progressive, it's actually probably harder for me to adduce the arguments against affirmative action. Let me give you the arguments under counterintuitive modalities for affirmative action, right? So I think that most people say, well, if you look at the text of the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause, or if you look at the intent behind the Equal Protection Clause, right, affirmative action was not contemplated by the framers, and so therefore the formal vision of equality should prevail. So in order to get to the anti-subordination account, you would actually either have to take a prudentialist or a doctrinal, more stream of time vision, a modality that was more permeable to streams of time. And I actually want to argue that that's incorrect, right? So for a couple of reasons. So first of all, starting with the text, as we always do in constitutional interpretation. Again, the text of the Equal Protection Clause says, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Right? One of the things that's curious about the text of the Equal Protection Clause is that it does not specify a particular group, and it articulates equality at a very high level of generality. Right? So, for example, the Equal Protection Clause does not mention race in the way that the 15th Amendment does, which extends the franchise to everyone regardless of race. Right? Nor does it say, we're going to enumerate a set of groups, as many civil rights statutes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do, and saying we protect individuals on the basis of race or gender or national origin or religion or color. Right? None of that kind of enumeration is there. So we could contrast that with many of the structural provisions of the Constitution, where the framers were quite specific. So when the framers say you have to be 25 years old to be a representative, or 30 years old to be a senator, or 35 years old to be president, to run for president, nobody comes in and says, well, I'm going to litigate that because the lifespan was much shorter then, so 25 years in is more like 40 now, and so let's have litigation over that. The terms are so specific that nobody would actually gainsay that the framers meant what they said and they said what they meant, right? Contrast those structural provisions of the Constitution, which tend to be much more technical. Jeff was talking the other day about the pardon power, right, but also the constitutional amendment procedure and how specific the guidelines are about those particular provisions. Contrast that with the great overarching phrases of the Bill of Rights, like freedom of speech or equal protection of the laws or due process of law, which are much, much more abstract. So I'd argue from a textualist perspective, it's really hard to sustain the argument that the framers wanted equality to remain static, right, in the way that it existed when the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, right, or in the case of the Equal Protection Clause in 1868. Right? Rather, they adverted to a higher level of generality because they wanted to leave to the intelligence of successive generations what the content of equality would mean for that generation. So I think I can make a very strong textualist argument looking at levels of abstraction at which certain constitutional guarantees are pitched to make the claim that equality was meant to be permeable, right, to social developments over time. Then we get to the specific question of saying, well, all right then, let's say that I grant you that that there's a plausible argument to be made there. Let me grant you that assumption. Now grant me one of mine. Let's just assume that the intent of the framers meant what they said at the time of the framing of the 14th Amendment. So give me the assumption that the intentions of the framers of the 14th Amendment should control in this case. Even then, I think that we have a very strong case for affirmative action, because the same Congress that voted out the 14th Amendment, and specifically the Equal Protection Clause, also voted out requisitions to all black schools, right? And the fact that they thought that they could constitutionally vote out requisitions only to all black schools without voting out similar requisitions to all white schools suggests that they did not see an equal protection violation in thinking about the Equal Protection Clause through the anti-subordination lens rather than through the formal equality lens. Right? So one of the things that's very curious to me is that the originalists on the court, like Justice Thomas, are very, very quiet about the originalist modality when it comes to affirmative action. And I believe that they're quiet because they don't have a case, right, for how they can, get to, striking down affirmative action programs on the basis of the Equal Protection Clause when both of their favored modalities, textualism and originalism, disfavor that move.
That's exactly right. You've just heard Kenji give an argument for liberal originalism, suggesting that the original understanding, faithfully applied, should uphold affirmative action rather than strike it down. I guess the counter would be, although they've never made it, that the framers of the 14th Amendment intended a formal equality not for all governmental action, but only for what they called civil rights, but not political or social rights. And they didn't think that the right to go to school was a civil right because it wasn't broadly provided by the government. And therefore, at the time, you could give special benefits to African Americans to go to school. Now you could argue that the right to go to school is a civil right. You should have colorblindness across the board, but that requires an act of translation that the originalists are usually not willing to make, and to extend the original understanding more broadly than its original purpose. What Kenji has shown us is that these modalities of interpretation are not always played out before the Supreme Court, and that's why you need to understand them, so you can hold the court to account and make sure they're faithful to their own methodologies. Another huge case next term that will pit equality against liberty, in particular free speech, very dramatically, is the Baker case that we have discussed a little bit earlier. This is a tough case to balance two really important values. Describe what the legal principles are and what some of the arguments on both sides involve.
Great. So this is a Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And what the facts of the case are is that there's a baker in Colorado who bakes, wedding cakes. And a same-sex couple went into the store and said that they wanted a cake. And at the point where he realized that they were a same-sex couple, he said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot serve you. I would happily, serve you with regard to, say, any of the other baked goods that I offer. But when I make a wedding cake, I so personalize it that this would be against my religious beliefs, and it would be compelled speech, by me, by the government." So this is a fascinating case because the statutes and the statute in play is a Colorado state statute, not a federal statute. So there's no federal protection against sexual orientation discrimination in public accommodations. But Colorado does have a state law that bans discrimination in public accommodations on the basis of sexual orientation. What Colorado does not have on the other side is a Religious Freedom Restoration Act law, the so-called mini RFRAs, and the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, for reasons that are probably too boring to go into here, but I'm happy to go into if it's of interest in Q&A, does not apply, at the state level. Right? So there's this state non-discrimination law, and then the only defense that the baker has is either a defense under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, or alternatively, free speech. The Free Exercise Clause claim is really, really hard to make, right? As I think even the individuals who are proponents of religious freedom in this case would agree, because of a 1990 case written by Justice Scalia, where he said if the law is of general applicability, is not enacted with any kind of animus towards a religious group, then the court will engage in its lowest level of scrutiny known as rational basis review. And as I'm fond of telling my constitutional law students, all you need to pass rational basis review is for the legislation to be framed in grammatically complete sentences. Right? So this is a very, very deferential form of review. It's a line I stole from Janet Halley, again, up at Harvard Law School. But so the stronger claim there is, as I just said, the speech claim. And the idea that if you have a non-discrimination statute on the basis of sexual orientation that forces the baker to create a message of celebration in his cake, right, because he is an artisan, right, is crafting this cake, then that is compelled speech on the behalf of the government. The government is compelling him to say something that he doesn't believe in, right? And so what the Supreme Court has done is it's granted review in this case. And it's fascinating that they granted review in this case because it suggests that it wants to take this step by step, right? Because the most compelling claim, I think, will be when, as in the Hobby Lobby case, a Religious Freedom Restoration Act claim can be made because there is a state RFRA, right, against a non-discrimination statute that is co-equal to it, and how will the court, thread the needle on that. But what the court has done by granting certiorari or review in this case is to say we're going to take up the free speech claim first, and then we'll deal with the religious freedom case and some other fact pattern that actually raises it. So when we think about this solely as a matter of compelled speech, we're situating this against cases like the Woolley case or the more recent Walker case, where plaintiffs have actually prevailed against laws that say you have to have on your license plate, live free or die in New Hampshire, or the Confederate flag, on your license plate, that would be sort of a form of compelled speech, right? And so those are that's the line of cases that we're talking about, where I say, the government is not allowed to make me say things that I actually don't believe. And so if I don't believe that same-sex marriages should be permitted, the government can't force me through its non-discrimination statute to utter that speech, right? I think that the key distinction, unfortunately or fortunately for me, comes from a case that I was a plaintiff in and lost, right? So this was a case regarding gays in the military and don't ask, don't tell. So I and a bunch of my colleagues sued Donald Rumsfeld, right, because we thought that the Solomon Amendment was unconstitutional. So the Solomon Amendment was an amendment that said, unless you grant military recruiters who discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation equal access to your campus recruiting services as all other recruiters, then the federal government can withdraw, in our case, hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funding from the organization. So it was partially a spending clause issue, but it was also a First Amendment issue about compelled speech. And we lost that one, and Chief Justice Roberts, in writing the opinion, said anyone can tell the difference between speech that a school is sponsoring and speech that the school is required under law to engage in. So in that case, it was expressive association rather than speech and words coming out of my mouth sense. But I think that case is going to be very, very salient in this Masterpiece Bake Shop case, because similarly, right, the court could say that precedent disposes of this case in principle, because surely someone can tell the difference between a cake shop that says we are doing this under duress, and here is a statute that requires us to do it, which they're totally welcome to post within their shop, right? So, and that no reasonable observer would confuse what they're doing with an endorsement of same-sex marriage.
Fascinating. I want to take a vote, a constitutional vote. Kenji just really well described the arguments on both sides. So as you heard him, the question is whether the baker who's saying that we'll sell cakes to anyone, we just don't want to put a message that we disagree with on our cake, whether forcing them to put the message on the cake is a form of compelled speech that could be confused with their speech rather than the government requiring them to say it. That's the nub of the issue. And I want to ask you, having heard these arguments, not is it a good or bad idea, but do you think it is a form of unconstitutionally compelled speech to force the bakers to put on wedding cakes messages with which they disagree? Who thinks that it is a form of compelled speech that violates the First Amendment? To put the message on.
Specific message.
Yes, we celebrate same-sex marriage, absolutely. And who thinks it is not a form of compelled speech? And who changed his or her vote after hearing Kenji describe the arguments really well on both sides? You hear the point of this exercise? These are tough cases. You need a brilliant guide like Kenji to fairly and accurately describe the competing statutes, the precedents, the constitutional arguments, the history, in order to begin to balance this like a constitutional lawyer rather than just expressing your political views. And I hope that you're going to see Kenji's beautiful, balanced statements as a model for the kind of self-education you have to do. Okay, now on to the travel ban case, which we will, Kenji will help us understand in legal rather than political terms. There are a couple of questions there, but one there's a constitutional claim about religious freedom and there's a statutory claim, and there are two statutes, one passed in the 50s that says the president can exclude anyone he wants at the borders, and one passed in the 60s that says he can't exclude people based on their religion. How might the court balance the competing claims here?
Right, yeah, so I believe that the 64 statute says you can't ban people on the basis of national origin, right, and that's the real conflict. But I'd actually like to sort of just shave that off and talk about the constitutional claim simply in the interests of time. And the constitutional claim is really what the Ninth Circuit did in Travel Ban 1.0 and what the Hawaii District Court did to Travel Ban 2.0. And essentially is a claim that the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which is in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, and it says something along the lines of Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And it's been understood to mean that you cannot privilege one religion over another, or under some views, religion over non-religion, right? But you certainly can't privilege one religion over another. And so what is going to be at issue in this case is, was this restriction, right, on travel from now 6 countries ban based on religion, or was it based on some threat of terrorism coming from those states? So there's been no act of terrorism that has emanated from the states, in my understanding, since 1975, right? So one of the things that the court is going to be grappling with is classic constitutional analysis about under-inclusiveness and over-inclusiveness, right? So one of the terms that we socialize constitutional law students in practically from day one of the constitutional law is, how do you figure out what the real intent is, right? Generally, right, the legislatures, including Congress, or governmental actors generally, including President Trump, don't come out and say, we want to discriminate against Muslims. In Donald Trump's case, in President Trump's case, he did do us that favor, right, on the campaign trail, so it was reasonably explicit there. But then the question is whether or not we can carry over statements made in a campaign when, you know, people will say lots of things in a campaign, and so can we really say that that was the gravamen or the driving force behind the executive order, right? So when you don't know, when intent is unclear, what the court will do is to look at whether or not the governmental action is over-inclusive or under-inclusive in a way that suggests that it is not tailored, right, to the intent that the government has put forward. So here, the two competing interpretations of the travel ban are the government's stated purpose, which is, you know, we want to keep the country safe, which is obviously a compelling governmental interest, right? And then the alternative, which is we want to discriminate against people who are Muslim, right? And so when you look at the government stated intent, constitutional methodology requires us to begin with what the government actually said its intent was. And then we engage, you know, if there is a constitutional provision like the Establishment Clause on point, with an under-inclusive, over-inclusive analysis. So the first question is this over-inclusive? Does it sweep really broadly, right, and too broadly? And the answer to that is, I think, yes, right, given that, you know, anyone, right, who belongs to, was a national of any one of these 6 countries, unless they have, right, a bona fide tie to the United States that pre-existed the ban, right, is going to be banned from the country. So surely that is over-inclusive, right? And then the question is it under-inclusive, right, with regard to its stated ends? Like, is it really getting at all the people who could pose a threat to this country? And the answer to that, again, from my perspective, is, again, it's under-inclusive, right? So that suggests that this is not well-tailored legislation. So it's either sloppy, or alternatively, it is more narrowly tailored to a separate end, right? And the separate end to which it could be tailored is potentially discrimination against the Islamic religion, right? And so if the court finds that, then it will be struck down. There are some complications here, though, however, right? Because even when you move to saying, oh, you know, national security was just a pretext, and what they're really going after is, you know, discrimination against Muslims, as one of the jurists on the Ninth Circuit with Travel Ban 1.0 pointed out, Judge Clifton on the Ninth Circuit, you know, if you want to say this is discrimination against Muslims, it's also over-inclusive and under-inclusive, right? In the sense that this is not a ban on all Muslims globally, right? And it's under-inclusive in saying that, there are individuals who practice a faith who have been admitted into the country and who are viewed to be completely loyal Americans, right? So I think that that's going to be the wrinkle with the Establishment Clause claim in the case.
And what do we know from the Supreme Court's disposition in June? Chief Justice Roberts, in a masterpiece of pragmatism, said, start the clock ticking and come up with another policy now, suggesting that the case might be moot by the time that it reaches the court, and the court won't have to evaluate the last travel ban if there's a new one. But in an interesting concurring opinion, Justices Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito suggested that there was a majority of the court to reject the Establishment Clause claim. How did you read those tea leaves?
Yeah, so exactly as you did, which is to say that there's a set of doctrines called the non-justiciability doctrines, or sometimes also referred to as the justiciability doctrines, which involve things like, whether or not something is poorly timed. So under Article 3 of the Constitution, only cases or controversies can come before the court. So there actually has to be real litigants on both sides, and the time has to be right. It can't either be too soon or too late to bring the case before the court. So if you have those restrictions in place, and the reason behind the restrictions should be pretty obvious, right? We want people who have a dog in the fight to be bringing these cases into court and battling each other out. We don't want people who just are hobbyists who are coming into court saying, we're interested in what the court has to say about this. And in fact, one of the earliest acts of the Marshall Court was for George Washington to come to the Marshall Court and say, will you issue an advisory opinion about this matter? And the Marshall Court said, no, we're not in the business of issuing advisory opinions. Bring an actual case in the lower courts and then we'll hear it. So in this particular instance, what we see is, as you say, classic sort of John Roberts kind of temporizing, trying to say, as much as possible, we're going to try to keep the court out of matters that are such hot button issues that aren't necessarily justiciable at the time. So mootness means by the time this actually hits the Supreme Court this fall, it could be completely mooted out, right? And so that is certainly an option, and he's giving the administration that out. Right? And so that might suggest that he believes that the administration would be humiliated if it came before the court and the ban would have to be struck down. But I think probably a more sensible way of reading that would be to say that he doesn't want the court to be embroiled in something that's inevitably going to be seen as political, and he doesn't want the court embroiled in the very tricky separation of powers issue where the president usually has, in combination with Congress, because they're the politically elected branches, plenary power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution over natural issues, right? On the other hand, this dissent is also very interesting, right? Because, Alito, Gorsuch, Thomas, we're all saying that, they are intimating, right, that they believe that there should be a blanket, right, stay of the lower court decision, meaning that, strike that, there should be a blanket non-stay, right? That Justice Roberts said certain parts of the order should not be allowed to go into force while the litigation was pending, and these conservative dissenters said no, the entire order should be enforced immediately, and so they set the default in different directions pending the resolution of the case. And the legal standard for whether a preliminary injunction should issue is whether or not there's a likelihood of prevailing on the merits, and so there's some intimation there that they did not believe that the litigants, that the state of Hawaii, for example, would prevail on the merits in the Supreme Court case. So I think that side of the tea leaves, we read the same way.
It's so important to get your guidance on the competing arguments on all of these issues which will be decided next year, all of which involve equality. Isn't it fascinating, ladies and gentlemen, that all the cases we're talking about involve the balance between equality and other values? But I want you to also help our colleagues understand how notions of equality evolve over time. So one of the big issues that is being mooted right now is the meaning of Title VII, which forbids discrimination on the basis of sex. The Trump administration has just filed a brief in a lower court saying that because of sex should not include because of sexual orientation. The Obama administration had not taken a position on that question. It's a huge one. Tell us about what the statute says, what the legal arguments on both sides are, and how a statute which presumably was not passed to encompass sexual orientation in the 1960s might be construed to encompass it.
Great. So the case or the statute that we have to begin with is not a provision of the Constitution, but rather is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I've alluded to that earlier. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has many different titles. Title II covers public accommodations, and that's what we were discussing earlier. Title VII covers employment, right? But the forbidden grounds, right, on the basis of discrimination, let's take the employment context, because that might be the most familiar one, under Title VII are race, color, sex, national origin, and religion. So those 5 grounds are impermissible. So we're actually kind of odd, right, and an outlier among societies in the world in saying you can fire anyone for any reason, right? So we have the employment at will doctrine, right? But the employment at will doctrine has certain carve-outs, and some of those carve-outs are embodied in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So when you think about the word sex, right, in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, clearly, as Jeff was saying, no one is arguing that at the time when it was enacted that the LGBT community or sexual orientation was meant to be included within the rubric of sex, right? 1964 is 5 years before the Stonewall riots of 1969, which are often seen to be the beginning, right, of the modern gay rights movement in this country. So this is not even a gleam in the eye of the individuals who were enacting the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You know, some historians might quibble with that around the edges, but I don't think anyone is seriously making the argument that from an originalist perspective now with regard to the statute that the framers of the Civil Rights Act meant to include sexual orientation. So this is where I lose, quite frankly, if we take an originalist interpretation. But this is where I think it's really important to drive a wedge in between originalism and textualism, which I said I would do earlier on in this chat. And I think textualism and originalism are often conflated with each other. But textualism, I think, has to be distinguished from originalism, because even if the framers didn't intend to use a particular word in a particular way, that word can carry a meaning and a logic of its own into the future that need not, some people might believe that it should, but need not necessarily be bound by the original, right, intent of the framers. So the original intent of the framers of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, those legislators in Congress, clearly didn't mean sex to encompass sexual orientation, but they did use the word sex. And over time, we've come to an understanding that the notion of sexual orientation discrimination is a build on sex discrimination, because it's impossible to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation without a pre-existing notion of sex. Right? So if there were no genders or sexes in society, if we couldn't tell men from women, the idea of sexual orientation would be meaningless, right? Because sexual orientation is recursive, right? It builds on the notion that there's a gender of object choice, and for there to be a gender of object choice, there needs to be a gender, right? So using that analysis, that textual analysis, Judge Wood of the Seventh Circuit in the recent Hively case ruled for the entire Seventh Circuit, meaning that it was an in-bank decision where all the judges on the Seventh Circuit participated in this decision, all the active judges, I should say. And she wrote for a majority of the court, and she said, we understand that historically this is not what it meant, but if we actually take the word and the logic of the word is that sexual orientation can't exist without sex, and so therefore sexual orientation discrimination is a form of sex discrimination, right? So what you'll see, right, and please watch this space as this case percolates up through the courts, is, you know, Sessions making, I think, quite plausible argument, right, and in fact the better argument from an originalist perspective, that the framers of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not intend to cover sexual orientation. If Congress wants to enact the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would cover sexual orientation, it's completely free to do that, but that's up to Congress to do, not for the courts to interpret. Vis-a-vis this Diane Wood interpretation, she's a redoubtable jurist, and she's been on the short list for the Supreme Court for many years. So, you know, she's a very well-regarded jurist on the nationally and on the Court of Appeals as well. Against her sort of very well and closely reasoned opinion that reasons from the notion that you can't have sexual orientation discrimination without sex discrimination. So intervening years have enlightened us with regard to the meaning of what the word sex means in that piece of legislation.
Marriage equality. You've written an incredibly moving book about the Proposition 8 trial in California. I want all of you to get it and read it. And you describe in the book very vividly how that affected you personally, culminating in your marriage to your wonderful husband, who's here with us tonight, as well as the transformation of constitutional understanding and how the meaning of liberty came to be transformed. Tell us both of those stories.
Yes, so this is actually a wonderful period of both my professional life and my personal life, because as I was writing this book, our husband and I were awaiting the birth of our second child, our son, and our surrogate lived in Topeka, Kansas. And this goes back to the speech issue and why I might be more sympathetic to the speech claims than many other individuals who are gay rights advocates, as I consider myself to be, in the interest of disclosure. But one of the things that occurred was that we kept getting invited, both when our daughter was born and when our son was born, to all of these barbecues, right, by perfect strangers. And the first time we did it, we just, sort of went along and we're very grateful for the hospitality, and we just thought this was a marvelous expression on the part of the community. The second time we were completely exhausted, right? Because we had a 14-month-year-old, daughter, and then we were waiting for the birth of our son. And so I complained to my husband, that this felt like death by 1,000 barbecues, right? And my husband revealed himself, as he does every day, to be my better half by saying, these people have opened their homes to us. We were terrified coming here that there would be a lot of animus towards gay couples. They've shown us the exact opposite. So we are going to every single one that we're invited to. And that proved to be exactly right. And he again teaches me every day how to be a better human being, which I think is about as good a testimonial to marriage equality as you can hope for. But one of the things that we did do is that we asked our surrogate, what is going on here? And what she said was, it's because in Topeka, you're in Topeka, and Topeka is the headquarters of Westboro Baptist Church. So this is the church that holds up, God hates fags, signs, and around military funerals or, et cetera, and indeed, litigated one of these cases and prevailed all the way to the Supreme Court in the Phelps case. And what she said is, before this, I think most people would just not have had a view or have thought it through, but they were so embarrassed that Westboro Baptist Church was now so closely associated in the national imagination with, Topeka, that they really had to have a think about how they felt about same-sex couples and same-sex marriage and, the kind of surrogacy arrangement that we've entered into. And so what you've seen is an embrace by this community on their own after they've thought about it, right? So one of the things that's interesting about this is that it is a kind of Nazis get to march in Skokie story, right? Because unless the Nazis get to march in Skokie, then you don't have the countervailing, right, deep thought on the part of individuals, regardless of where they ultimately fall out, right? So I'm not saying, like, if you think deeply about this, there's only one way to stand. But this notion that if you think about this deeply, you're going to come to your own views about this, and those own views your own views are going to be much more vehement, right, than they would be if the government were forcing you to do it, or if you hadn't had occasion to think about it, if you hadn't been exposed to the hate speech that would lead not to censorship, but rather to censorship, right, but through counter speech and counter mobilization, right? So I think that is one of the stories that I tell in this book. But really, the book is also broadly about how oftentimes I feel like all of us who teach in law school should rename our schools of law to be, I think I even heard Alan Morrison talk about this, to be schools of fact, right? Because we think about the law-fact distinction in law a lot. One of the things that I think that trials in particular are doing within the judicial system are really getting to the fact of the matter, right? So it pains me to say it. It's a matter of actually real sorrow for me to have to say this. But in a world where facts themselves seem so unstable, and we live in a world of alternative facts, and it used to be that you had a right to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. That doesn't seem to be true anymore. Everyone seems to be entitled to their own facts as well as their own opinion. Right? That the trial in this case really sort of brought the two sides together, forced them into a clash of proofs. Right? And then one side, the same-sex marriage side, prevailed simply because the arguments on the other side were simply as a matter of fact, as a matter of science and social science, not strong enough, right? So I do think that one of the great services that the law can provide is actually establishing facts on the ground in a way that cascade out and trickle out through the broader society. So I would think of the intelligent design trial that occurred in Pennsylvania to be very similar, where there's a huge movement behind this notion of intelligent design, which was creationism sort of poured into new bottles. But finally, a judge said, enough with this. I'm just going to have a trial. Both sides can bring their experts in their A game, and we'll sort it all out. After those 5 weeks, it was very clear that the intelligent design was simply creationism, and we had already that ship had already sailed with regard to the Supreme Court saying, creationism can't be taught in the schools without violating the Establishment Clause. So that was another case in which, facts really mattered. Yet another case in which facts really mattered was the whole woman's health case decided a couple of terms ago, where the question was whether or not seeming health requirements that up the game of abortion clinics throughout the state of Texas were really there to protect women's health or were really there to prevent abortions. And again, there was a trial about it. And after the trial, it was really, really difficult to argue that this was in furtherance of women's health, as the justices, when it finally went out to the Supreme Court, said, Justice Sotomayor said, liposuction is more dangerous than abortion, right? But you're not requiring doctors who perform liposuctions to have admitting privileges to the nearby hospitals. You're not requiring clinics that perform liposuctions to have hospital-grade ambulatory surgical centers, right? That would cost them millions of dollars to upgrade. You're closing down, 3/4 of the clinics in Texas by enacting this law. So it, explain to me why this is more about women's health than it is about shutting down, shutting people out from abortions. So I could go on and multiply examples, but I think that one of the great services that the law and the legal system can provide for us is a stable, still commonly respected way of generating not legal outcomes, but factual determinations. So the trial courts and trials are going to be increasingly relevant in the rocky times ahead.
And one of the powers of your book is you describe how the trial of Prop 8 combined an attention to facts and empirical evidence with personal stories and narratives, and the judge and the state were moved by how those two things reinforced each other, and they could relate to individual stories and see that they were generalized by facts.
Exactly right.
You've written some really beautiful books about law and literature, and this wonderful book about what Shakespeare can teach us about law. It's the largest question, but this is an interdisciplinary institute. What can literature teach us about equality? Yes,
so wonderful. So, I know the College of the Atlantic has a deep and abiding commitment to the humanities, and I so celebrate that at a time when it's often said that the humanities are in crisis. I have often said that issues of diversity and inclusion and issues of the humanities, both of which are deemed to be sort of flashpoints within the culture right now, are two challenges that actually solve each other, right? Because the thing that diversity and inclusion cries out for is really narrative, right? Because anytime you talk about diversity and inclusion in terms of groups, right, individuals within those groups cry out and say, you're actually not representing my experience at all. And what can do that besides literature and allowing us, and Martha Nussbaum at the University of Chicago's words, to empathize with distant others, right, through our reading of realist literature, right? If we think about why the humanities are in crisis, it's really a crisis of relevance, right? And what greater, end could you have as the humanities than to expand the moral imagination and to actually be put in the service of the idea that there are many different ways to be a human being, right? So I think that they are in conversation with each other in that way. In the trial itself, there's a kind of cautionary word that one could say about narrative, which is I think that one of the reasons why law in general and equality law in particular has been very, very leery about imbibing narrative. And this concern goes all the way back to Plato's banishment of the poet from the city back in Book 3 of the Republic. One of the things that really worries the law about literary narrative is that it is incredibly moving, it's incredibly seductive, but it's also incredibly idiosyncratic. So if the Supreme Court is making policy for 300 million plus people, it can't say, because we heard this incredibly moving story from one individual, we're going to create a law, right, or a legal ruling that's going to bind everyone in the country. So how do we thread that needle? One of the brilliant things that was done, as you mentioned, in the trial, the Prop 8 trial on same-sex marriage, was that the litigants were incredibly intentional. And Terry Stewart, who was the unsung hero of that litigation, insofar as, Ted Olson and David Boies, because they're extraordinarily famous, extraordinarily able lawyers, really commanded the spotlight throughout much of that litigation. But Terry Stewart was the person who said, we need to have lay witnesses in this trial. So we're finally getting a trial on this issue. Let's not waste it. And let's have lay witnesses, but let's intersperse them with expert witnesses. So Harvard literary scholar Elaine Scarry says that you always need a balance, right, in any matter of judgment, right, between narrative compassion and statistical compassion. This is an oldie but goodie, as will be exemplified article, as will be exemplified by the instance that she uses, where she says, President Reagan had a great deal of narrative compassion, but he had no statistical compassion. So I'm reporting, not endorsing here, right? This is what she says, not what I'm saying, because I have no view on this. But what her claim is that if you were homeless and you spoke to President Reagan about your experience of homelessness, his eyes would tear over and he would have a genuine emotional response to the fact that you were homeless. And that's why he was so revered and was a Teflon president, because he would have these real reactions to the human suffering that was before him. So that's narrative compassion. On the other hand, she argues he had no statistical compassion. You could give him sheaves of data about homelessness in America, and his eyes would glaze over, right, in the bad way, right, in the sense that he would just be bored and he would not be able to see within that sheaf of papers the suffering embodied within those numbers. What Scarry argues is that we need both, that one in and of itself is not enough, because we need the emotional engagement, but we also need to be shown that that emotional engagement is not leading us down the garden path, but rather is representative of a broader human experience. So in this trial, that balance was manifested by the fact that the lay witnesses were interspersed with expert witnesses. So, on day 5 or 6 of the trial, Ryan Kendall, who was an individual who had tried to change his sexual orientation through conversion therapy. One of the issues in the trial was whether or not sexual orientation was an immutable characteristic, because in order to be treated like race or like gender under the Constitution and to get a heightened level of protection, you have to show that your group is politically powerless, that it has an obvious immutable or distinguishing characteristic, and that there's a history of discrimination against your group. So immutability was front and center as one of the things that the plaintiffs had to prove. And so they had Ryan Kendall talk about how hard he had tried, as someone who'd grown up in an evangelical community and whose parents desperately wanted him to change his sexual orientation, and how he had been radically unsuccessful. And there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when he told his story. But that in itself would not have been sufficient, because that's only narrative compassion. 2 days later, Gregory Herrick, a social psychologist, came in and said 90% of the individuals that he has studied, and all of his samples, have fixed sexual orientations, and that Kendall's story of how difficult it is to change one's orientation was representative of at least 90% of the population, right? And so that kind of 1-2 punch of combining the narrative compassion with the statistical compassion was the power of the trial. So I don't think either witness would have been as forceful, right, without the other, right? Because Herrick's testimony went on for 8 hours and involved a lot of charts and graphs and was pretty tedious, frankly, right? But it was brought to life by Kendall's narrative. But Kendall's narrative standing alone would not have been representative enough, or we couldn't have had the confidence that it was representative enough for Judge Von Walker ultimately to rule in favor of the plaintiffs on the immutability question.
My goodness, I've failed as a moderator because I've been so engrossed by this conversation. We don't have time for many questions, but we'll take just 1 or 2.
Professor Yoshino, you did a wonderful job of taking us to the legal issues in Masterpiece Cake Shop, but in a certain sense you stopped just a little bit short.
Mm-hmm.
I know how reluctant legal professionals are to predict what the court will do.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think will happen in this case goes to the court? I see the presence of Justice Kennedy there. The man has a legacy running from Romer through Lawrence, through Windsor, through Obergefell. Is he going to stand to see that legacy undermined, or will he settle for the case being narrowly decided because this is artistic expression?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and you're obviously very, familiar with Justice Kennedy's opinions. Can I just back up and say that I always point out how important, these rumors about, Justice Kennedy's retirement are. As Jeff is 110% right, was 110% right when he said the other day, nobody knows when these justices are going to retire until they actually do so. So I'm not claiming any insider knowledge. But I am saying that Justice Kennedy is likely to be the swing vote, as he has been in so many cases. And also that is a luxury, right, at least from a progressive perspective, because we only got Justice Kennedy because Robert Bork went down, right, in his nomination hearing. So if Bork had actually been confirmed, none of these would be 5-4s in our favor from a progressive perspective. So when people complain about having to argue over Justice Kennedy, you weren't complaining, but others do. I say that's a luxury. We should glory in the fact, because we can imagine all too easily in the near future that we won't have that fifth vote to argue over, right? The trouble with Justice Kennedy in this particular instance is that he is a diehard, LGBT rights advocate, as you've suggested. All 4 of the major LGBT rights cases were written by him, and you've enumerated, all 4 of them, spanning from Lawrence to Obergefell. But he is also very, very staunchly behind the First Amendment and speech, right? And so this is going to pit, as evidenced by Citizens United, for example. So this is going to pit 2 of his deepest commitments against each other, and I think that's why this is going to be a bit of a tricky case to navigate. The one thing that I do think is interesting, that if I were a betting man, I would say that I would, not very confidently bet on the LGBT rights, side, the plaintiffs prevailing in the case, is the Roberts opinion that I was citing earlier, which is to say, the only way in which they can win this case, in my view, is on a free speech ground, right? And on a free speech ground, what we see is Roberts having told us that there is a big difference between speech that you are sponsoring yourself, right, and speech that you are being forced to articulate because the government has forced you to do that, and that the people at large, the American polity, is fully capable of making that discernment, right? So if that distinction holds, it may be that Roberts, right, is a vote, right, for the LGBT plaintiffs on the speech claim. Well, the thing that's tricky about this case is that it actually doesn't tee up the central concerns in each case, because the central concern on the Masterpiece Cake Shop's part is not really compelled speech. It's religion, right? It's really that we have religious and sincerely held objections to same-sex marriage, right? So we have to sort of find a way to allow that expression, but that's not going to be fully expressed through speech alone, right? So we're going to have to wait, I think, for the next case for there to be a real standoff, right, in between religion and LGBT rights and equality, LGBT equality, or to put it less tendentiously, between religious equality and LGBT equality, right? Because the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is not in play here, either at the federal level or at the state level. So we're going to have to find a case with different facts that tees up the religion claim more squarely for the justices really to have their feet put to the fire with regard to where they stand. To be clear, I'm a very strong, there is no religious right to discriminate kind of guy, right? So I look back to the early cases in the civil rights era where, there were barbecues that said the felicitously named Piggy Park case, right, where the barbecue said, we have religious objections to interracial commingling, and so therefore we're not going to serve, African-American individuals. That didn't make it up to the Supreme Court, but, the last court to have decided at the district court level said no, like religious objections can be overridden here because there's a compelling governmental interest in eliminating race discrimination. Same with the Bob Jones University case, right? So ultimately, I think that's where we're headed. My hope there is that the court will find a compelling governmental interest in non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, as it found in the case of racial discrimination. But I'm not at all confident about that, particularly since justices like Alito have argued in the Hobby Lobby case, race is a compelling governmental interest, but he was notably silent, right, about whether or not sexual orientation discrimination would count, right, as a kind of discrimination that would rise to a compelling governmental interest, such that it would override a free exercise claim even made by a corporation, which would be the case in the case of a cake shop. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this case, but only because the real issues have not been teed up. I don't think that the speech claim is that strong. I think that the religion claim in this case is frivolous, right? When we go down the line and there's actually a statute on the books, or it's a federal entity, if we can imagine that is can properly invoke the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, then it will be the issues will meet each other much more foursquare. Right, and it will be the classic, Isaiah Berlin thing about how the most difficult things in life are not good versus evil, but good versus good. Well, we'll really have to balance those two goods.
So I want you to have a chance to meet Kenji and get his book, and you can ask him more questions then, so I'm going to stop. But what I want to do is say how excited I am to have shared with you this brilliant legal mind, America's leading scholar of equality, and to have provided for you a model of how he fairly and accurately describes the hard competing interests on both sides. He weighs them. You see the nuance and the humility with which he presents the arguments. And I really want you to remember his example as you approach the hardest of all questions of the Constitution in the future, which involve questions of equality. Justice Holmes said that the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view. And that's what the effort to define the meaning of constitutional equality involves, and Kenji has provided us a model for how to strike that balance. Please join me in thanking Kenji Yoshino.